Gita Gopinath, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, has said recently that we are on the verge of a debt crisis, that countries during the pandemic have accumulated enormous amounts of public debt, and that those deficits that continue to be large and are seen as being large, certainly in the United States, are a problem for the world economy. We have here Stephanie Kelton to discuss those things with us today. My name is Matías Vernengo, and this is Policy Parlor, the podcast of the Bucknell Institute for Public Policy. Stephanie, thank you for being here.
Nice to be with you.
So Stephanie is, I want to introduce her first. She is a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. She was the chief economist of the Senate Budget Committee, an advisor to Bernie Sanders, one of the main proponents of modern monetary theory. And, she's exactly very knowledgeable about the issues of debt and deficit. So first question to you is, why shouldn't we be concerned with the deficits in the United States that are large and whatever they are, 5-6% of GDP, and the deficit and the debt that is about a little bit more than 100% of GDP? Is that a problem? If not, why?
Well, what would be signs that it was a problem? That's the place that I would like to start. So, let's make one thing clear. I like to get this out right away. Every deficit is good for someone. We should acknowledge that, because what is this thing we refer to as the government deficit? It's the difference between outlays, how much money the government puts into people's hands each year, and receipts, how much they take away. So when they add more than they subtract, it means they're making a financial contribution. It means they're net adding, dollars to the rest of the economy. So in purely financial terms, every deficit is good for someone. The question is, for whom and for what? What are the deficits being used to accomplish? Are we getting better public services, better infrastructure, healthcare, education? Are we doing large tax cuts that mostly deliver a windfall to people at the very top of the income distribution? Both of those are ways to use the deficit, but they're going to impact people very differently, right? So could you push the deficit up so high that it starts to create real problems? And the answer is sure you could. And how would that manifest? Well, a very obvious place to look would be inflation. So if you had a deficit that was growing very rapidly, pushing too much money into too many people's hands, and they were going out trying to spend that, and the economy couldn't keep up with all that demand, you would start to see rising inflationary pressures. That would be a problem. So, if we were in that space where we saw inflation accelerating, you could say, maybe we've got a deficit problem, in the sense that the deficit is the source of the inflationary pressures. I don't think a lot of people today, maybe there are some, surely there are some, who would argue that the deficit has gotten too big and they want to try to reduce things. We got DOGE, and I'm sure you want to talk about that at some point, right? Efforts to cut government spending. But the reality is inflation has been trending down. It's gotten a little bit sticky, but we're right in the kind of 2.5.
But let me ask you this, sort of a variation of that. Perfectly. So your point is well taken, that, deficits and debt per se are not bad or good. It depends on how you use them, and they could be large if you have inflation. And if you're, we shouldn't be concerned that we have, $30 trillion of debt. Is that we have $30 trillion of debt and not necessarily good healthcare and good infrastructure and so on and so forth. So all perfectly reasonable. But what if Larry Summers comes here, and I'm going to be the Larry Summers advocate, the little joke there, and he says that, well, the inflation that we have with Biden was because he did say it's the worst mistake in the last 40 years. It's the $1 trillion package that he passed at the beginning of his government. So did that cause inflation? And if not, what was it?
I will say this: it contributed at the margin to inflation. I think we should be honest, and I think we should acknowledge that. But I think we should also recognize that inflation was a global phenomenon. Inflation went up everywhere. And in the US, we peaked, the headline inflation, CPI, peaked at 9.1% in the summer of 2022. There were countries that had higher inflation than we had that did less aggressive fiscal spending than we did. So everybody got inflation. It wasn't something that you could trace to the amount of fiscal policy support that we got here in the US. It was breakdown in global supply chains. It was pandemic related. It was supply shocks. And then it was, different waves of the pandemic. People forget that it didn't just come in one wave. There was this Delta variant, and then more shutdowns happened as a result of that. And then there was an Omicron variant, and then there was a war between Russia and Ukraine. We just kept getting slammed to food and energy.
Price,
right?
Food prices.
Exactly.
And different times at which the port in Shanghai or the port in whatever shut down because of pandemic, and that strained the supply chains.
Yeah, so I think the people who are doing, the people who were most invested in the narrative, people like Larry Summers, have, I think, something to gain in trying to persuade everyone that they were right and that they were right about the diagnosis, what drove the inflation. I would prefer, when people are that close to the argument, to rely more heavily on observers who don't have a dog in the fight. So let's say somebody like Moody's Analytics or the Federal Reserve Bank or even the IMF, people who can take a more dispassionate look and say, where did the inflation problem really come from? And when you do that, and you look at the research and what people have said, it's overwhelmingly supply side, the pandemic. People like, Ben Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard, they did an analysis, and that was their conclusion. It was mostly driven by supply side shocks and so forth. Demand played some role, and the stimulus was a contributor.
What would be the correct monetary policy to, follow this inflationary bout that was not caused by the fiscal policy or not fundamentally by it? And what do you think the policies of the Fed, the actual policies of the Fed, in light of your reply, what should have been the reaction? How did they look like?
Look, I do not think there was ever a case to raise interest rates. That is an unpopular opinion. Not many people share that opinion, but I firmly believe that. I think that Jay Powell and the Fed were right early on when they saw inflation increasing, and they said, this is the pandemic. This is supply chains. And you will remember well this word transitory. And people, they heard the word transitory. And what a lot of people thought that meant was short term, that it meant that the inflation wouldn't last very long. And I never heard the word transitory in that way. I always thought transitory meant that the inflation would abate as we transitioned out of a pandemic wrecked economy. And then the war created further problems. But, Powell used to get up in front of the podium and say, we're not raising rates because rate hikes don't fix supply chains. Rate hikes don't bring down energy costs. Rate hikes don't bring down, he would explain. And I think what happened is that he just got beat up by people like Larry Summers, who kept complaining, you're behind the curve, you're not doing enough. And at some point, the Fed just said, okay, inflation has broadened into some other categories. This is the only tool we have. We're going to start raising interest rates. And I'll just say very quickly, the Bank of Japan is really the only central bank that I think did the right thing. They stayed pat, and they didn't raise interest rates, even as inflation accelerated for the first time. Japan has been fighting deflationary pressures for the better part of 3 decades. And all of a sudden, the pandemic comes along, and now inflation is above target for the first time, really, in decades. And the Japanese central bank didn't say, oh my God, we have to start raising.
Which we may very well say, what's the problem with that? I mean, nobody can tell you why it should
2%.
be 2% or 3% or 4%.
Right.
Makes no significant difference. But a follow-up on that, because I think there is an interesting question that lingers there. So you say the Fed shouldn't have hiked the interest rate. But on the other hand, inflation did come down, and we didn't have another thing that Larry Summers said, that we should have had 10% unemployment in order to reduce inflation. But the Fed didn't throw the economy into recession. So the hike in the interest rate wasn't at least as high as to cause significant damage to the economy. It did cause certain things, and I think actually it might have caused inflationary problems in the sense that higher interest rates impact mortgages, and that impacts rents and so on and so forth. But it wasn't to the point in which they caused a recession, which they did several times before.
Well, that's for sure true. And I think a few things are going on there. So one is that there was so much foaming of the runway, if you like. There was so much fiscal support that it allowed the Fed to do what it's done historically, which has led to a wrecking of the economy as the Fed raises interest rates. And man, they raised interest rates aggressively. This was an aggressive tightening
The
cycle.
fastest in
right.
decades.
And you would think, oh, this is gonna produce the outcomes that Larry suggested that we needed: high levels of unemployment in order to get inflation under control. And it didn't. It created some pockets of problems in the housing market and so forth, but it didn't create broad-based pain in the economy. And in part, I think it's because people had good balance sheets. Corporations had termed out debt, households had refinanced, everybody was in a fixed rate mortgage with low interest rates, and it just didn't have, the interest sensitive parts of the economy are few, and they just didn't get wrecked. And at the same time, the rate hikes put a lot of money into people's pockets, because when the Fed raises interest rates, it forces Treasury to pay out a whole bunch more in terms of interest on the debt, and that income also helps support the economy.
Yep. I mean, I always say there were 3 episodes in which the investment in private fixed housing fell and did not cause a recession. 1953, it was the Korean War. 1967, the Vietnam War, and recently in 2023, and it was the Biden fiscal package.
There you go.
That pumped the pandemic, so to speak. So 2 wars and a pandemic. And the spending.
I mean, we lost a couple of banks, but we didn't get a financial crisis. We didn't, there was all kinds of concern about commercial real estate and the problems there. But so far, knock wood, we managed to get the coveted so-called soft landing. And I don't attribute that to anything the Fed did. I just think that the Fed was able to raise interest rates without wrecking the economy for the kinds of reasons that you and I were just discussing.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to some of issues that of MMT and the idea that, for example, people tend to think that taxes finance spending, and there is sometimes a notion that, well, we tax the rich, and that will allow us to, spend on whatever the Green New Deal. So even followers of Bernie Sanders, who you were still, I suppose, are connected and are an advisor to, would take that kind of understanding of how that sort of works. So can you tell us a little bit of why that's not a good way of looking at this or thinking about that in that way?
I mean, there's a lot of different things. If you're a member of the Senate, you're working on legislation, you want to do things. If you're a Bernie Sanders, you want to try to make investments in areas where you can lift people up, especially people who are struggling, working class folks, poor folks. He wants to make investments, whether it's canceling some student loan debt, Medicare for all, big infrastructure, Green New Deal, that kind of stuff. There's a game that's played in Washington, and it's the pay-for game. And so you write a bill, and you want to get co-sponsors, and you want to get members to vote for your bill. That's how things become law. You need votes, right? So you want to spend a bunch of money, and you want to go to your colleagues and say, won't you vote for my bill? Help me pass this, and we'll make all these investments. And the first thing somebody says is, how are you going to pay for it? So they want to know what they're voting for. What tax increase are you asking me to vote for? Because I want to be perceived as fiscally responsible. I don't want to do something that's going to increase the deficit, that's going to add to the debt. So the game is structured so that you have to go around finding pay-fors. So where do you kind of aim your fire if you have to get more revenue? Well, it's like the old Willie Sutton joke. Why'd you rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. So why do you want to tax the rich? Because that's where the money is, right? You go after rich people. And so you say, well, there are these people with, billions and billions of dollars. If we could just peel off a little bit in the form of a wealth tax or a financial transactions tax or whatever the case may be, we'll just tax the rich. That will give us the revenue that will allow us to spend on all of these priorities. Okay, so that's the game. The problem is the votes are never there. I mean, even when Biden was president and the Democrats had the House and the Senate, President Biden said, I want Build Back Better. I want to do $3.5 trillion of spending. I want elder care and child care and infrastructure and climate related. I want all this stuff, and I have a plan to pay for it. And he wasn't going to increase the deficit. He wanted to raise taxes on corporations, raise taxes on the rich, and all the rest of it. And guess what happened? Democrats are
Senator Manchin
and Sinema, but guess what? They're just the two most public about it. There, I assure you, were lots of other Democrats who were not prepared to vote for the slew of tax increases, even though they were aimed at people making more than $400,000 a year. So it is a problem. The politics are a problem when even within your own party you don't have the votes. And so where does it leave you? It's like we can't feed a hungry kid or fix crumbling infrastructure unless we can tax the rich. But if the votes aren't there to tax the rich, then where it leaves you is with hungry kids and broken infrastructure, because you don't end up acting.
So, last question, and changing gears a little bit. So we now are, in the Trump presidency again, and we have been going through, at least rhetorically, the discussion of cutting spending, the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, getting into, the several departments and firing people and suggesting that there is a lot of waste and that we're going to cut spending. We'll see that to what extent that happens. Today we had a labor report that was actually reasonably good. But there are lots of fears of what are the effects of that. There's also a lot of fear about the tariffs, which again, he puts tariffs, then postpones the tariffs and so on and so forth. But what would be the effects of possibly spending cuts, possibly very high tariffs? What are the prospects of the American macroeconomy given the current sort of policies being discussed?
People will have less money and they will be paying higher prices. Those are the consequences. The consequences of the cuts. They're starting off slow, but I think it's.
But do you think that those will happen? So
they're happening. They're happening. I mean,
I don't mean just in Medicaid, which they will.
I'm sorry, I meant job cuts. I was talking job cuts.
Okay, no, okay. Those are happening.
Those are happening, definitely. And this is the calm before the storm. We're just getting started.
This report already had 10,000 less
right.
federal jobs, so that's visible. But it was compensated by other things. My question to you is more like, do you think that they're gonna, if they go really for this, they can tank the economy? So do you think that that's something that it's in the cards?
Yes,
do you think that...
Absolutely. Look, I think that Republicans, the old joke, you had one job. Right? They have one job, and that is to get taxes down. If they can't cut taxes, what are Republicans even for? So I think they feel like they have no choice but to hold together and to manage to get the tax cuts extended. They are expiring at the end of this year. And Donald Trump's priority is extending the Trump tax cuts.
But do you think that they're doing the cut of spending as a way of justifying the tax cuts later on in the year?
Yes. I mean, this is really hard because it's the sausage making, and the Republicans are not aligned on this. There are Republicans who have districts where an awful lot of their constituents depend on Medicaid. And they're already grumbling about this, $880 billion in proposed cuts that are mostly coming out of Medicaid. There are Republicans who have concerns about that. But at the same time, you have to deliver on the president's agenda. And the centerpiece of the agenda is, border and tax cuts. And so one way or another, they're going to get there. I don't know who's going to make the biggest compromises on the spending side, but they're not going to get everything they want on the tax side either. This promise of no tax on tips and overtime and Social Security, there isn't enough headroom in the budget resolution. The way that Republicans in the House have written it, they've got $4.5 trillion of tax headroom. And extending the tax cuts, just extending what we already have, eats up almost all of that. So if you want to start adding additional things, then you have to start getting creative, right? Well, how much of that are we going to have to offset? And so there's a lot of horse trading that's going to take place. But I think they're going to try very hard to push through some pretty painful cuts.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Stephanie. And we'll be back in another episode with Ibrahim Shikaki talking about the Palestinian economy. Thank you for listening.